For 35 years, she was just a ghost, a silent figure known only as Caledonia Jane Doe. Her story seemed to begin and end in a desolate cornfield in upstate New York. For decades, her identity was a complete mystery, a name lost to the wind. But her name wasn't Jane Doe. It was Tammy Jo Alexander. And while an incredible chain of events finally gave her a name, the even bigger mystery of who ended her life remains a haunting, unanswered question. This is the story of how a simple act of remembrance reignited a decades-old cold case, and the ongoing search for a killer who has walked free for over 45 years. On the morning of November 10th, 1979, a farmer in Caledonia, New York, a small rural town south of Rochester, was checking his fields. In the distance, he spotted a flash of bright red near the edge of his corn property just off US Route 20. Figuring it was a hunter trespassing, he moved in for a closer look. What he found wasn't a hunter. It was the body of a young girl. When Livingston County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the grim scene, they found a victim who appeared to be a teenager. She was fully clothed in tan corduroy pants, a plaid shirt, and a very distinct red windbreaker with black stripes down the arms. She'd been shot twice with a .38 caliber weapon. The medical examiner later pieced together the brutal sequence of events. She was first shot in the head, right above her eye, while standing near the road. The attack likely came as a complete surprise, since she showed no signs of flinching. She was then dragged into the muddy cornfield, where her killer shot her a second time, this time in the back, and left her for dead. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately. Her pockets were turned completely inside out, a clear sign her killer had deliberately taken any form of ID. To make things worse, heavy rain that night had washed away nearly all potential forensic evidence. Investigators had very little to go on. A body with no name, no wallet, and no witnesses. They couldn't even use dental records to identify her, as it seemed the young woman had never undergone any dental work. The case grew into the most extensive criminal investigation in the history of Livingston County. They nicknamed the victim Caledonia Jane Doe, or Cali Doe for short. The community, though they didn't know her name, mourned for her, eventually burying her in a local cemetery under a headstone that read Jane Doe. For years, law enforcement chased thousands of leads, but every single one went cold. Cali Doe remained a ghost, her story frozen in time. The first and most basic question, who was she, would stay unanswered for more than 3 decades. To find the beginning of this story, you have to travel nearly 1,300 miles south of that New York cornfield to Brooksville, Florida. This is where Tammy Jo Alexander grew up. Born on November 2nd, 1963, Tammy Jo's childhood was anything but perfect. Those who knew her described her as bubbly and personable, someone to whom people were naturally drawn. But her home life was turbulent, and she spent time living with different relatives and in foster homes. Her mother was a waitress at a truck stop, and Tammy Jo also worked there for a while. It was a world she was familiar with. By her mid-teens, she'd become an experienced hitchhiker, often catching rides with truckers to get away from home. Her half-sister, Pamela Dyson, later stated that Tammy Jo had a history of running away, but she always returned. The family grew accustomed to her occasional disappearances, always expecting her to return through the door eventually. Sometime in early 1979, 16-year-old Tammy Jo left home again. This time, though, it was different. This time, she never returned. For years, her family held on to a painful, flickering hope. Pamela Dyson said she always imagined her half-sister had just started a new life somewhere, that she'd gotten married, had kids, and was happy. The alternative was just too dark to think about. What happened next is somewhat unclear. Her family insists her mother filed a missing persons report, but maybe because of Tammy Jo's history, it was never taken seriously. Law enforcement, on the other hand, stated that no official report was ever actually filed. For whatever reason, her name never made it into the national databases that could have linked her to the unidentified girl in Caledonia. For 35 years, her family wondered where she was, while a group of dedicated investigators in New York wondered who she was. They were two sides of the same tragic story, utterly unaware of each other. The break in the case, when it finally happened, didn't come from a dusty file or a high-tech lab. It came from the simple, persistent memory of a friend. In 2014, one of Tammy Jo's high school classmates, Laurel Knoll, decided to look for her old friend online. When she couldn't find a single trace of her, she grew worried and contacted Tammy Jo's family. That one message spurred Pamela Dyson, her half-sister, to take action. She called the Hernando County Sheriff's Office in Florida in August 2014, but was told there was no active missing persons report for Tammy Jo Alexander. A report was filed immediately, and for the first time, Tammy Jo's information was officially entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, or NAMUS. That single act set everything in motion. An online sleuth and forensic artist named Carl Koppelman, who was a moderator for the Cold Case Community Web Sleuths, had sketched a portrait of Caledonia Jane Doe back in 2010 and posted it to the NAMUS database. In September 2014, when Tammy Jo's new profile popped up, Koppelman had a gut feeling. He saw a striking resemblance between the photo of the missing Florida teen and his sketch of the girl from New York. He immediately emailed the Livingston County Sheriff's Office to alert them to the possible match. Investigators followed the lead and arranged for a DNA sample from Pamela Dyson. On January 26, 2015, the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed what Koppelman suspected. The mitochondrial DNA from Caledonia was a match. After 35 long years, the girl in the cornfield had her name back. She was Tammy Jo Alexander. The community that had cared for her as Jane Doe held a new memorial service, replacing her anonymous headstone with one bearing her real name. It was a moment of profound yet bittersweet closure. The family finally knew what happened to their lost girl, but the relief was drowned in the horror of her final moments. As her sister Pamela said, "I'm truly glad for the closure, but it hurts to know she died that way." With her identity confirmed, the investigation shifted dramatically. As Sheriff Thomas Dougherty put it, "We've always said one of the biggest parts of solving this case is knowing the victim." The case that had been cold for decades was now, in his words, burning hot. Investigators could finally start tracing her last known days. Leads that had been useless for years suddenly took on new meaning. Pollen analysis done on her clothing suggested she'd recently been in a warm climate like South Florida, a perfect match for her home state. But the most critical lead came from a waitress at a diner in Lima, New York, just miles from Caledonia. The waitress remembered serving a young woman who looked like Tammy Jo on the night she was killed. She wasn't alone. She was with a white man, about 5'9", who wore black, wire-rimmed glasses and drove a tan station wagon. He paid for their meal, and they left together. This man has never been identified and is still a key person of interest. Investigators have looked into numerous theories. In 1984, the serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to her murder. But his confession, like hundreds of others he made, was deemed not credible and had no evidence to back it up. Another theory pointed to Christopher Wilder, a serial killer who targeted young women and was known to attend auto races. A possible link to the auto sports brand jacket Tammy Jo was wearing. But Wilder was killed in a police shootout in 1984 before he could be questioned. The biggest modern break came from evidence that was preserved for decades, her clothing. From that clothing, forensic scientists developed a profile of unknown male DNA. This has allowed investigators to test persons of interest against it. In 2016, 3 men who knew Tammy Jo through a former prison ministry program were tested, but none of them were a match. The search continues, with that DNA profile remaining a vital piece of the puzzle. In 2020, investigators even released audio clips of Tammy Jo's voice from an old cassette tape, hoping the sound of her slight southern accent might jog someone's memory. Decades have passed since Tammy Alexander was murdered. Thanks to a friend who didn't forget, and a sister who didn't give up, she's no longer the nameless girl in the cornfield. She has her identity back, her story, and a family that mourns her. But the final chapter remains unwritten. Her killer has never been brought to justice. For over 45 years, someone has carried the secret of what happened on that rainy night in November 1979. They took a 16-year-old girl's life and got away with it. But investigators haven't given up. The Livingston County Sheriff's Office and the FBI are still actively working the case. There is a reward of up to $20,000 for information that leads to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible. Cases this old are often solved because one person, who knows something, finally decides to speak up. A memory, a conversation overheard years ago, a nagging suspicion. Any of it could be the key. The search for justice for Tammy Jo Alexander is not over. If you have any information about this case, no matter how small it might seem, please contact the Livingston County Sheriff's Office at 585-243-7100 or the FBI.